I stood in the living room and looked at what Carol had done to my house over the past 3 years. Where Dorothy's silver-framed photograph used to hang, there was now an abstract painting in black. Dorothy's chair, where she liked to read in the evenings, had disappeared a month ago. Carol said it was spoiling the overall look of the interior. It's been replaced by a glass table with sharp corners, which I've already bruised myself twice. Daddy, could you move your newspaper somewhere else? Carol came into the living room with the phone in her hand, businesslike and focused as always. I have an important client today, and I'm going to show him pictures of the house. Those old newspapers on the table look unkempt. The newspapers were in the same place I'd left them for 40 years, on the coffee table next to the couch. Dorothy never objected to that. She understood that a man needed his own place in the house, even if it was just newspapers and reading glasses. I remembered her sitting next to me and reading the headlines over my shoulder, sometimes commenting on the next political news or city event. Ours. "This is my house, Carol," I said quietly, not lifting my eyes from the morning news bulletin. "And my newspapers." She pressed her lips together, but remained silent. In recent months, I'd noticed that she'd been holding back her irritation in my presence more and more. She used to be more direct in her demands, but now it was as if she were waiting for the right moment. Her face took on a peculiar expression, a strange smile and cold eyes that appraised me as if I were real estate for sale. Harvey appeared from the kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hands. My son, in his 42 years, looked like a tired man who had long ago stopped making his own decisions. He avoided my gaze, as he'd been doing more often lately, and sat down on the couch across from me. He'd once been a straightforward guy who said what he thought. Now it was as if every word he said passed through Carol's invisible filter of approval. "Good morning, Dad," he mumbled, staring at the screen of his phone. "How's it going?" "I'm 75 tomorrow," I reminded him. "If you could call that good business." Carol and Harvey looked at each other. It was the kind of quick exchange of glances that people do when they know something others don't. I've been a railroad engineer for 35 years, and I've learned to notice the small details that can portend serious problems. When a train is going downhill, the driver sees something wrong long before the passengers sense danger. "Oh yes, a birthday," Carol smiled, but the smile didn't touch her eyes. "We haven't forgotten. We even have a surprise for you." A surprise. There was something in her tone that I didn't like. Dorothy always said you should trust your first impression of people, and my first impression of Carol when Harvey had brought her over to meet her 8 years ago hadn't been the best. She seemed too calculating then, too interested in what neighborhood I lived in and how much my house might be worth. She walked around the rooms as if she were already figuring out what could be changed and what should be thrown away. "Dad, do you remember how Mom always baked you a cake for your birthday?" Harvey asked suddenly, finally looking up from the phone. Of course I remembered. Dorothy used to bake chocolate pecan cake, my favorite. She'd start cooking 2 days in advance, buy the best ingredients, and the whole house would be filled with the aroma of vanilla and chocolate. Then we would sit at the same table, drinking tea from her favorite china set and sharing plans for the future. Dorothy always knew how to turn an ordinary day into a celebration, even if we didn't have much money. "I remember," I answered briefly. "Maybe this year we'll order something from the candy store," Carol suggested. "Or we could go to a restaurant. Why go to all that trouble at home? It's a hassle at home." That's what she called all the things that made a house a home, not an office to show clients. Over 3 years, she gradually eliminated everything that reminded her of Dorothy and our life together. First, the lace doilies that Dorothy knitted on long winter evenings disappeared. Then the family photos were gone from the walls. Carol said they were too personal for the common area. Then Carol rearranged the furniture, changed the curtains, and even replaced the dishes with some white plates with no pattern. "No thanks, Carol," I said. "We'll celebrate at home." Carol looked at Harvey again. This time I definitely picked up something tense in their silent dialogue. My son rubbed his neck nervously, a habit from his childhood that betrayed his excitement. He did it whenever he knew he was doing something wrong, but he couldn't stop. "Okay, Dad," he agreed too quickly. "Of course it's better at home." I folded the paper and looked at them both carefully. Carol was standing by the window, holding the phone as if she were waiting for an important call. Harvey sat on the edge of the couch, ready to get up and leave at any moment. Both of them looked like they wanted to be anywhere but here. in this living room with me. The atmosphere in the house had become somewhat electric, charged with anticipation. Once upon a time, Harvey would come to me with any problem. We could sit in the garage for hours and he would talk about school, about friends, about girls. I taught him how to change the oil in the car and fix broken gears. Dorothy always said that my son and I were alike, not only in looks but in character. Both stubborn, both honest. Back then, he would look me in the eye when he spoke, and I always knew what he was thinking. Now Harvey was a stranger in my house. He was working as a programmer for some company, making good money, but he looked miserable. Carol guided him the way she had guided change in my house, gently but insistently, leaving no room for objection. She had a way of making people think they'd made the decision she wanted them to make. "I'm going to go check the mail," I said, heading for the front door. "Dad, wait," Harvey called out to me. There might not be anything interesting in there." That was an odd phrase. Why did he think there might be something interesting or uninteresting in my mail? Usually it was just utility bills and flyers, occasional letters from the insurance company or the bank. Nothing that would excite my son. "We'll see," I replied and stepped out onto the porch. It was a cool September morning, but the sun was beginning to warm the air. My house had been on Oak Street for 40 years, and I knew every tree in the neighborhood, every crack in the sidewalk. The neighbors changed, but the house stayed the same. A two-story house with white walls and blue shutters that Dorothy had picked out when we first moved here. Back then, we were a young couple with a young son and big plans. We had a 20-year mortgage on the house. Dorothy saved money on everything so we could pay off the mortgage early. She sewed curtains herself, grew vegetables in the vegetable garden behind the house, bought clothes only at a discount. But after 15 years, we became full owners of the place. I remember when we celebrated the last installment. Dorothy baked a huge pie, and Harvey and I hung an American flag on the porch. The mailbox was really just bills and advertisements. Nothing special, as always. An electric bill, an offer to change my phone rate, an advertisement for some new store. But when I returned to the house, Carol and Harvey were standing next to each other, looking at me as if they were waiting for some news. "Nothing interesting," I confirmed my son's words. "Good," Carol exhaled with obvious relief. Now I finally realized that something was going to happen tomorrow that I shouldn't know about. But what could it be in the mail that was bothering them both so much? I had received all correspondence in my own name for years. No one had ever inquired about the contents of my mailbox. "Carol, what kind of surprise did you have in store?" I asked bluntly. She flinched as if I'd caught her in the act. "It's not a surprise if I tell you in advance," she said, but her voice sounded unnatural. Harvey got up from the couch and stretched, clearly trying to act casual. "Dad, do you remember when you and I used to go fishing on Lake Norman when I was little?" he suddenly asked. I remembered, of course. We went every weekend when I had a free Saturday. Harvey was about 10 years old then, and he loved to sit on the shore with a fishing rod, even if the fish weren't biting. Dorothy would pack us sandwiches and a thermos of hot tea. We'd come home tired but happy, and Dorothy always had something nice to say about even the smallest fish. "Why don't you want to go?" I suggested it. No, Harvey waved his hands quickly. "I just remembered. I've got so much work right now that I don't have time to even think about fishing." Work. Harvey worked remotely, sitting at his computer at home all day writing programs. Carol said he had a very demanding position, but I never saw him enjoy it. He used to want to be a physics teacher like his mother. Dorothy taught at the local school and loved her job. Harvey inherited from her a hunger for knowledge and the ability to explain complex things in simple terms. "I see," I said. "So tomorrow we'll just celebrate at home, in the family circle." Family circle. 3 years ago, when Dorothy died, that family circle consisted of Harvey and me. Then Carol suggested they move in with me, so I wouldn't feel lonely. It seemed like a concern at the time. Now I realize that loneliness can be much better than bad company. "Yes, in a family circle," Carol repeated, and there was something strange in her voice again. I went up to my room, leaving the two of them alone in the living room. Muffled voices came from behind the closed door. They were whispering about something, but I couldn't make out the words. Only intonations, and I didn't like those intonations. Harvey sounded guilty, and Carol sounded determined and cold. I sat on the bed and looked at the picture of Dorothy on the bedside table. Carol hadn't put that picture away yet. I guess she thought it was appropriate to keep a picture of his late wife in an old man's bedroom. Dorothy smiled from the picture with her kind, slightly wry smile. She always felt people better than I did, always knew who could be trusted and who couldn't. What do you say, Dorothy? I asked the picture quietly. What are they up to? Of course, there was no answer, but somehow I remembered how Dorothy had once told me to be careful of people who were too interested in your money or property. At the time, I had thought she was being overassured. Now her words took on a very different meaning. September 24th began as an ordinary day, except that it was my 75th birthday. I woke up at my usual time, but there was an artificial bustle in the house. Carol had been running around the kitchen preparing breakfast since morning, though she usually limited herself to coffee and toast before work. Harvey was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read the news on his tablet, but I could see his gaze constantly drifting to his wife. "Good morning, birthday boy," Carol said in an overly chipper voice as I came down to the kitchen. "Sit down. I've made you a special breakfast." There were indeed dishes on the table that hadn't been here in months. Scrambled eggs and bacon, fresh buns, orange juice in a tall glass. Everything looked appetizing, but somehow it looked like the set of a play. Carol fussed around the stove with the determination of a condemned man's last meal. "Thank you," I said, sitting down in my seat. "It's unexpected." "No, it's not," she said. "A birthday only comes around once a year." "Right, Harvey?" My son nodded, not looking up from the screen. He was dressed in a shirt and jeans, though he usually worked from home in gym clothes. His hair was neatly slicked back, the expression on his face of a man preparing for an unpleasant conversation with his boss. "Harvey, why don't you have something to eat?" Carol suggested. "You need your strength for today." Strength for today. That's another strange phrase. Usually people talk about strength for work, for training, for a long trip. But what kind of strength would my son need at home on my birthday? "I'm not very hungry," Harvey muttered, but he took the bun and began to chew it slowly. We ate in relative silence. Carol glanced at the clock on the wall, and Harvey picked at his scrambled eggs with his fork without looking up. Usually at breakfast, we discussed the day's plans, the news, or just chatted about the weather. Today, everyone was in his own thoughts, and those thoughts were clearly not about celebrating my birthday. "Do you remember, Dad, when we celebrated your 60th? Harvey suddenly asked. "Mom made a huge cake, and we invited the neighbors over." Of course I remembered. Dorothy was still alive then, and the house was full of laughter and conversation. The Jims from next door came, old Mrs. Parker from across the street, even a young couple with small children who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Dorothy set the table in the garden, hung garlands between the trees, and everyone felt like they were at a big family party. "That was 15 years ago," I said. "A lot has changed since then." "Yes," Harvey agreed quietly. "A lot." Carol got up from the table and began clearing away the dishes, even though we hadn't finished eating. Her movements were sharp, nervous. She dropped her spoon twice and once nearly broke a cup. Normally, Carol had an ironclad composure, but today something was clearly throwing her off balance. "Carol, are you all right?" I asked. "Of course," she answered a little too quickly. "I just want everything to be perfect. It's a special day. A special day." Why was everyone talking about how special it was? 75 is a respectable age, but it's not special enough to be so nervous. After breakfast, we moved into the living room. Carol sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, and Harvey settled down beside me. But even here, the atmosphere remained tense. Carol was looking at the door as if waiting for someone, and Harvey was rubbing the edge of his pillow and avoiding my eyes. "So, when are we going to celebrate?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Shall we call one of the neighbors?" "No," Carol said too harshly. "I mean, we shouldn't. We'd rather spend some quality time together. Family's the most important thing, isn't it? Family's the most important thing." Dorothy always said that, but it sounded sincere to her. With Carol, it sounded like a learned phrase from some family psychology textbook. "Okay," I agreed. "So it's just the three of us." "Yes, just the three of us," Harvey repeated, and there was a certain doom in his voice. The time dragged on slowly. Carol got up and paced the room, then sat back down. Harvey was flipping through the news on his phone, but I could see that he wasn't reading, just glancing at the screen. I tried to turn on the TV, but Carol immediately asked me to turn it off. "Please, let's not have the TV on," she said. We need to talk. Like a heart-to-heart. Like a family. A heart-to-heart. But about what? In the 3 years we'd been together, we'd run out of things to talk about. Carol talked about her clients and deals. Harvey complained about work. I shared memories of Dorothy until I realized that those memories were annoying my sister-in-law. What do you want to talk about? I asked. Carol and Harvey looked at each other again. Their silent dialogue was beginning to bother me. It was as if they were speaking a language I didn't understand. About the future, Carol said at last. About what lies ahead for all of us. Sarah, what future? I wondered. I'm 75. My future isn't that long and it isn't that complicated. Don't say that, Harvey said. You're still in great shape. You could live many more years. Many more years. Somehow it sounded not like a wish, but like a warning. It was as if my son were telling me the weather forecast for tomorrow. Precipitation. Be prepared. Carol got up and walked to the window. Her back was to me, but I could see her shoulders tense. She was obviously gathering her courage for some important conversation. Raymond, she said without turning around, we wanted to talk to you about practical things. Practical things. Carol liked euphemisms. Practical, she called money. Delicate, she called unpleasant. And difficult, she called those situations in which she wanted to get her way at all costs. Otomy. What exactly were the practical things she was talking about? I asked. She turned around and I saw that her face was determined, almost rigid. It was the kind of expression one gets when one has made a difficult decision and is ready to go through with it. About the house, she said bluntly. About your house. What about my house? It's too big for one person, Carol continued. 2 floors, 4 rooms. I never said that. Yes, sometimes my knees hurt after a long walk, but I could climb the stairs in my own house without any problems. Carol had clearly made up this argument to justify what she was going to suggest next. What are you proposing? I asked, even though I was beginning to guess. Shakran, there are excellent homes for the elderly, she said in a soft voice. Very comfortable, with medical care. You won't be lonely there, and you'll make new friends your own age. A home for the elderly. That's it. Carol wanted to put me in a facility so she could keep me in my house. Everything was falling into place now. Her nervousness, Harvey's guilty demeanor, and all this talk of practical things. What did Harvey think about it? I asked, looking at my son. Harvey blushed and looked away. Dad, we're just worried about you, he mumbled. It's dangerous to live alone at your age. What if something happens? Something will happen. A lot has happened to me in 75 years. I've survived the death of my parents, military service, the birth of my son, the illness and death of my wife, handled a layoff when the railroad depot closed and found a new job, survived a heart attack 5 years ago and recovered without help. And now they were worried that something would happen? Carol, I said calmly, this is the house I bought 40 years ago. This is where Harvey was born and raised. My wife died here. My whole life is here. I understand, she nodded, but you have to be realistic. You're getting older, and you need help, and we can't live here forever. We have our own plans, our own lives, our own plans, our own lives. So 3 years of caring for the lonely old man came to an end. Carol was tired of playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law and wanted to finally become a full-fledged mistress of this house. Harvey sat staring at the floor, silent. My son, whom I taught to stand up for the truth and protect the weak, could not say a word in my defense. Carol had completely subjugated him to her will, and now he was just a puppet in her hands. And when do you think I should move into this wonderful retirement home? I asked. Carol licked her lips, a sure sign that she was nervous. We were thinking, maybe we shouldn't take too long, she said. The sooner you get used to the new place, the better. Don't take too long. So they wanted to get rid of me as soon as possible. Carol must have already found a buyer for the house or was planning to sell it. I see, I said. So this is your birthday present, an offer to move out of my own house. Carol blushed but didn't back down. It's not a present, she said. It's a concern for you. It's not like we're your enemies. Not enemies. But we're not friends by the looks of it. Just people who wanted my house and were willing to send me to some old people's home for it. I looked at Harvey, but he never looked up. My son, my only child, whom I loved more than life, sat next to me and remained silent while his wife planned my banishment. After the awkward conversation about the nursing home, a heavy silence hung in the living room. I sat on the couch mulling over what I'd heard, while Carol and Harvey seemed to be waiting for my reaction. But I wasn't going to make a scene or argue with them. At 75, one learns to save one's energy and not waste it on useless discussions. Over the many years I had worked on the railroad, I had learned one simple truth. Before reacting to unpleasant news, it was better to find out all the facts. "All right," I said at last. "Let's postpone serious talk. It's my birthday after all." "Where's the surprise?" Carol flinched as if she'd forgotten her morning promise. She glanced quickly at Harvey, who nodded as if he'd gotten some kind of signal. My son got up from the couch and headed for the closet in the corner of the living room. There, on the top shelf, was a beautiful box covered in gold paper and tied with a scarlet ribbon. It was quite large, about the size of a shoebox, and looked solemn and expensive. "This is for you, Dad," Harvey said, holding it out to me. "Happy birthday." His voice sounded strained, like he was reading from a sheet of paper. His hands shook faintly as he handed me the gift. I took the box and felt that it was quite light. There was something inside that rustled as it moved, not heavy, but voluminous. "Thank you," I said, looking at the wrapping. "It's beautifully wrapped." "Who made it?" "I did," Carol said. "I wanted it to be special." There was tension in her voice, and I noticed her hands clench into fists. Harvey sat back down on the couch, but sat on the very edge of it, ready to jump up at any moment. Both of them were staring at me as if I were defusing a bomb, not opening a birthday present. Carol even stopped breathing. I could see her chest stiffen. "Open it," she said hurriedly. "I wondered if you'd like it." I untied the ribbon and carefully removed the golden paper, as I always did when Dorothy gave me gifts. She laughed at my neatness, saying the gift paper would be thrown away anyway. But I was used to doing things slowly and thoroughly. Underneath the wrapping was a plain cardboard box with no inscriptions, just a plain brown box, the kind used for mailing documents. I opened the lid and saw several folded sheets of paper inside. On top was a sheet with an official stamp and a heading that made me frown. I took the document in my hands and read the heading aloud, slowly and clearly. Eviction notice. Carol and Harvey froze. The living room became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Dorothy had given it to me for our 10th wedding anniversary, and it had been ticking away for 35 years. Now its ticking seemed as loud as a drumbeat. "Eviction notice," I repeated, pulling all the papers out of the box. An interesting 75th birthday present. I flipped through the papers. Legal language, stamps, signatures. Someone had prepared these documents very carefully. They said I had to vacate the house within 30 days because I was only a temporary tenant with no title to the property. The wording was clear and ruthless, as legal documents should be. "Dad," Harvey began, but his voice trailed off, and he fell silent, swallowing. "Raymond," Carol stepped in, her voice sounding more confident. "I know it's a shock, but listen to me, please. Let me explain." I set the papers aside on the coffee table next to the morning papers and looked at my sister-in-law carefully. Her face had taken on a businesslike expression, the same one she probably used to talk to her clients when closing complex deals. Her shoulders were straightened, her chin slightly raised, the classic posture of someone ready to negotiate. "I'm listening," I said calmly. "The thing is, this house doesn't officially belong to you," she began, looking me straight in the eye. "I looked at the deeds when we moved here 3 years ago. The house is in Dorothy's name, and when she died, the title automatically passed to Harvey as sole heir. So there you go. Carol did a whole investigation, went through the deeds, and found a legal loophole. She was a smart woman, and I underestimated the extent of her determination to get the house. Apparently, while I was grieving for my wife, she was already planning my future exile." "I see," I said slowly. "What's next?" "Next," Carol continued, leaning forward slightly. "Harvey, as the rightful owner, has every right to decide who can live in the house and who can't. And we've decided that you'd be much better off in a specialized facility with round-the-clock care and medical supervision. A specialized facility." Even now she couldn't say nursing home outright. Carol had mastered the art of euphemisms, turning humiliating exile into an act of caring. Harvey, I turned to my son, keeping my eyes on him. Is this really your decision? My son looked up, and I saw in his eyes a mixture of guilt, shame, and despair. He looked like a schoolboy who'd been caught doing a bad thing, but had been forced to do it. Harvey opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Finally, the words did come out, hoarse and unsure. Dad, you realize we need to think about the future, our future. We can't spend the rest of our lives living in this house. My house? I asked with a slight chuckle. Carol had just explained to me that it wasn't my house. Harvey blushed even more, and red spots crept from his neck to his temples. Well, yes, it is. This is our home now, and we need space to live, to make plans. Maybe we'll have kids, and they'll need space. Kids! In 8 years of marriage, Carol and Harvey had never once talked seriously about children. Carol was too busy with her career and making money, and Harvey was too insecure to take on the responsibility of fatherhood. But now the mention of possible grandchildren must have softened the blow and made me feel selfish. So you want me to move out of the house I've lived in for 40 years? I summarized slowly. From the house I bought with my own money, where my son was born and raised, where I took care of my sick wife, and where she died in my arms. These are temporary difficulties, Carol put in quickly. We'll visit you, of course. Every weekend, I promise. And maybe in the future, we'll find some other solution that's better for everyone. In the future. Which could be 10 years from now, if I live to be 85. Very convenient wording. Promising something in a vague future without making any concrete commitments. Politicians love that kind of promise. What if I refuse to move out? I asked, leaning back on the couch. Carol and Harvey looked at each other again. Their silent dialogue was beginning to irritate me. It was as if they had rehearsed the whole conversation in advance and knew the answers to any objections I might have. Carol even smiled slightly, as if I'd asked exactly the question she'd been waiting for. Then we'll have to go to court, she said with a fake regret in her voice. I really don't want to go there, believe me. But the law is the law. Harvey is the legal owner of the house, and he has every right to evict anyone who lives there without his consent, even relatives. The trial. A public trial in which a son will evict his own father from the family home. The local papers would love to print the story. The neighbors would discuss it for months. Carol had thought of everything. She knew I wouldn't want to make a mess of things and would rather leave quietly than make a public scandal. I picked up the eviction notice again and scrutinized the signatures and seals. It looked very official and convincing. Carol must have consulted a good lawyer and spent a lot of money on the paperwork. 30 days, I read. That's pretty generous. Thank you for your generosity. We don't want to rush you, Harvey said conciliatory. We understand that you need time to find a suitable place and pack. A whole life isn't easy to pack up. Packing. A whole life. 40 years of existence in a few suitcases. Dorothy's photos, my books, tools in the garage, gardening tools, old letters, documents, furniture we bought together. How do you fit all that into a standard 3x4-foot nursing home room? Are you going to sell the house? I asked, putting the documents back in the box. We don't know yet, Carol answered, but too quickly and too easily. Maybe we'll live in it ourselves. Maybe we'll rent it out. We haven't decided yet. Of course we haven't. A $400,000 house in one of Winston-Salem's best neighborhoods, with a large lot and great accessibility. It is very convenient to get such real estate without paying a dime for it. Just wait for the old owner to die and kick it out on the street. I set aside the box of papers and got up from the couch. Carol and Harvey were tensely watching my every move as if they were expecting an explosion. They probably thought they were about to burst into anger, tears, or pleas for mercy, but I wasn't going to give them that pleasure. You know what? I said quietly, walking to the window. This is really a surprise. I never thought my own son was capable of such a thing. Harvey flinched as if I'd physically hit him. Dad, please understand. We're doing this for your own good, he mumbled pitifully. You'll be much better off in a nursing home. There's skilled nursing care, organized recreation, people your age, people my age, I repeated, entertainment. Yes, it must be fun to sit in a room with other people's old people and wait to die while playing checkers and watching TV. Don't say that, Carol exclaimed. jumping up from her seat. Modern homes for the elderly are not what you think. They're comfortable, safe, and have everything you need to live a full life. Comfortable and safe. It's like prison. Only there criminals are kept behind bars for crimes committed, and here old people are kept behind a fence out of hypocritical concern for a single crime. They have grown old and become a nuisance to the young. I went to the window and looked at my garden. Dorothy had planted roses there 30 years ago, and every spring they bloomed, reminding me of her. Red, white, pink. She chose the varieties very carefully, reading special magazines, consulting with salesmen. Now Carol will probably uproot these roses and plant something more modern and unpretentious, or asphalt the whole thing and make an extra parking lot for guests. Outside the window, a fine fall rain was drizzling, and the drops dripped down the glass, distorting the view of the garden. I stood and thought about how quickly life can change. In the morning, I was the master of the house, and by lunchtime, I was an unwanted tenant who wanted to get rid of me. You know, I said without turning around, I forgot to tell you something very important about this house. The silence behind me became even tighter and more tense. I could feel Carol and Harvey frozen, waiting for my words. There was a feeling in the air that something significant was about to happen. What was it? Carol asked cautiously, and for the first time all day, there was uncertainty in her voice. I turned around and looked at them both. Carol had a wary expression on her face, and Harvey was pale, as if he sensed the approach of imminent calamity. Nastonirami. And that's another story, I said with a smile, and I think you should hear it before you make any final plans to evict me. I went back to the couch and sat down in my usual place. Carol and Harvey looked at me with such intense scrutiny, as if they expected to hear a confession of murder. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. They clearly didn't expect me to have any information that might affect their plans. Sit down, I suggested. It's a long story. Carol sat on the edge of the chair, keeping her back straight, ready to jump up at any moment. Harvey lowered himself onto the couch beside me, but sat in the farthest corner, as if he were afraid to move closer. They were both waiting, and I felt I was holding them in suspense just as they'd been holding me all morning. You're quite right about the deeds, I began calmly. The house was indeed registered in Dorothy's name, but there's one small detail that you must have missed when you examined the papers. What detail? Carol asked quickly. Dorothy was a very thoughtful woman, I continued, taking my time. She'd worked at the school for 30 years and had seen all sorts of family stories. She'd seen children kicking out elderly parents, heirs fighting over property, people left on the street because of legal technicalities. Carol's face began to slowly pale. Harvey swallowed nervously and rubbed his neck. His old habit was becoming more and more noticeable. And what did she do? Carol asked quietly. In 2010, I said, savoring every word, 5 years before she died, Dorothy went to a lawyer. A very good lawyer, by the way, Mr. Francis Walters of the firm of Walters and Associates. You may have heard of him. He specializes in family law and probate. Carol and Harvey looked at each other, and I saw a twinkle of alarm in my sister-in-law's eyes. She clearly hadn't expected to hear the name of a particular lawyer. Dorothy set up a trust fund, I continued, a very clever legal construct. The house was transferred to the trust, and my wife became the trustee. After she died, I became the trustee. The silence in the living room had become so thick you could hear the raindrops tapping on the window. Carol sat still, but I could see the muscles in her jaw tense. Ah, what does that mean? Harvey asked hoarsely. It means, son, that the house doesn't belong to you, I said softly. It belongs to the trust, and as long as I'm alive, I'm the sole beneficiary of that trust. That means I have the right to live here until I die, and no one can evict me. Carol jumped up from her chair so sharply that she almost knocked over the lamp next to her. It's impossible, she exclaimed. I've studied all the documents, all of them. The house is in Dorothy Haley's name, and when she dies, it passes to the sole heir. You haven't examined all the deeds, I said calmly. You've only examined the ones in the city's real estate records. And the trust documents are in the law firm's archives and in the bank, which is the trustee. The bank? Harvey interjected in a weak voice. Sonornaturum. First National Bank of North Carolina, I clarified. They have a special division that deals with trust administration. Very reliable people. Dorothy chose them long and carefully. Carol started pacing the room, and I could see her brain working, trying to find a loophole in what she just heard. Her face took on the expression of a cornered predator. "Prove it," she said sharply. "Where are the documents? Show me those trust fund papers." "In the safe," I answered. "At the same bank, plus copies at Mr. Walters and another copy in my safe deposit box." Dorothy was very careful about such matters. "I don't believe it," Carol said, stopping right in front of me. "If such a fund existed, we would know about it. Harvey is a son. He had a right to know about such things." "Harvey knew," I said, turning to my son. "Sa, we told you, remember? About 10 years ago when Mom was doing all that paperwork. You said it was too complicated and asked me not to bore you with the legal details." Harvey turned even paler. I could see him straining his memory, trying to recall that conversation. And from the look on his face, he was really starting to remember something. "Yeah, I thought it was just a regular will," he mumbled. "I don't remember any trusts. Dorothy told you then that we made sure the house would always stay in the family," I reminded him, "and that no one could kick me out on the street after she died. Remember that now?" I could tell by the look on Harvey's face that he remembered. The memories were coming back to him, and he realized that he had made a huge mistake by not going into detail back then. But why didn't Mom tell him more details? "Sure?" he asked, confused. "Why didn't she explain how it worked?" "Because you said you weren't interested," I answered. "You were young. You had your own business. You thought the inheritance was a long way off, and you could put all the legalities aside for later." Carol sat back in her chair and wrapped her arms around her head. I could see her trying to digest the new information and find a way around the obstacle. "Okay," she said, raising her head. "Let's say there is such a fund. But that doesn't change anything. You can't live forever. When you die, the house will still go to Harvey." "Not a fact," I replied with a smile. "What do you mean, not a fact?" She jumped up. "There's an interesting clause in the terms of the trust," I explained. "After I die, the trustee has to find a new beneficiary, and it doesn't have to be Harvey." "What do you mean?" my son asked. "Dorothy foresaw the possibility of family conflict," I said. "She was a smart woman and realized that people can change. That's why she included a clause in the terms of the trust that only a family member who was worthy could become a beneficiary." "Worthy?" Carol interjected. "Who would determine that?" "A special committee of 3 people," I answered. "A lawyer from the foundation, a representative of the bank, and an independent expert in family law. They would review the applicant's applications and make a decision based on certain criteria." Carol stood up and started pacing the room again. Now she was no longer just nervous. She was furious. All her plans were falling apart, and she realized it. "What are these criteria?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Care for family, respect for elders, moral fiber," I listed. Standard stuff. Dorothy wanted the house to go to a man who would value it and respect the family traditions. Harvey sat silent, and I could see he was realizing the magnitude of the disaster. His attempt to evict his own father from the house automatically ruled him out as a worthy suitor. "It's not fair," Carol said. "Harvey is the only son. He has a right to inherit." "He was entitled," I corrected. "Until today. But serving an eviction notice on his own father on his 75th birthday? I'm afraid the committee won't look favorably upon such an act." "Who else could claim the house?" Carol asked. "Any blood relative," I answered. "I have a cousin in Texas, a niece in Oregon. Dorothy had a sister in Florida, but she died last year. But she had children. Quite decent people, by the way." Carol stopped and stared at me. "You're making this up," she said. "There's no trust. You're just trying to scare us." "Would you like to check it out?" I suggested it. "You could call the bank and find out. Or Mr. Walters. His office is on 4th Street in the old bank building. Very respectable place." Carol pulled out her cell phone and started dialing something. I watched her face as she searched for the number of the law firm. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for and dialed the number. "Hello, is this Walters' office?" she asked. "Can you please tell me if Mr. Francis Walters works for you?" "Yes, he specializes in trusts." "I see, thank you." She disconnected the phone and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just learned that the earth is round. "He exists," she said quietly. Of course it exists, I replied. Dorothy wouldn't trust her plans to a man who didn't exist. Harvey raised his head and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a little boy who realized he had done something irreparable. Dad, he said quietly, can we really be without a home? You can, I answered simply. And you probably will. After today's eviction notice spectacle, your chances have become practically nil. Carol sat back in her chair and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, whether from anger or despair. All these 3 years, she muttered. All the plans, all the calculations. All in vain, I agreed. I'm afraid so. Harvey stood up and walked to the window. His back was to me, and I could see the slump in his shoulders. My son realized that he had lost not only his home, but also his father's respect, and that was perhaps even more painful to him than the material loss. For the next half hour, I watched Carol's world crumble. She didn't just become upset or angry. She turned into a woman obsessed with a single goal, finding a way around the trust fund. Her business acumen, which I had previously underestimated, was on full display. Carol pulled out her cell phone and started calling everyone she knew in the legal field. Hi, Michael. It's Carol Haley, she said into the phone, pacing around the living room. Yes, from the real estate agency. I have an urgent question about probate law. Can the terms of a trust be challenged if there's any doubt about the capacity of its creator? I sat on the couch and listened to these conversations with curiosity. Carol was willing to question my late wife's mental health just to get home. Dorothy, who had taught school for 30 years, had earned a master's degree in education and had remained lucid until her last days. I see, Carol continued. What if the trustee is not behaving properly? Can he be replaced? Yes, I realize there would have to be a good reason. Okay, thank you. I'll think about it. She disconnected the phone and immediately dialed the next number. Harvey sat in the corner of the couch and looked at his wife with the expression of a man who sees her in a new, not very pleasant light. My son was finally beginning to realize who he had committed his life to. Sarah. Carol. Listen, do you know anyone who specializes in trusts? Carol spoke quickly, nervously twisting a strand of hair around her finger. I need to consult on a very delicate matter. Yes, urgently. Tomorrow morning? Great, write down the address. I got up and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. I wanted to drink tea and cookies, as I always did when I needed to calmly think about the situation. Over many years of working on the railroad, I had learned not to fuss in difficult circumstances. When a train derailed or a locomotive broke down, panic only made the problem worse. From the living room came Carol's voice, who was already talking to a third-party lawyer. She was trying to find out whether the trust could be invalidated on formal grounds. Improperly executed documents, irregularities in the creation procedure, lack of necessary witnesses. Carol was like a dog chewing on a bone, hoping to get to the brain inside. Annie, Dorothy was very thorough in all her dealings, I said, returning to the living room with a cup of tea. She spent 3 months studying the law of trust before approaching Mr. Walters. She'd even bought a special book called Estate Planning for Dummies and read it cover to cover. Carol interrupted the conversation and looked at me with irritation. Are you eavesdropping on purpose? She asked. This is my house, I reminded her. For now. And I have excellent hearing for a 75-year-old man. She gritted her teeth and continued talking, but in a quieter voice. Harvey got up from the couch and came over to me. Dad, he said quietly, I'm really ashamed of what happened today. I didn't know about the trust, honestly. Carol said she'd checked everything out, that everything was legally clean. You know, son, I said, taking a sip of tea, it's not about whether you knew about the trust or not. It's that you were ready to kick your own father out of the house, without any trust, just because your wife decided to. Harvey blushed and lowered his eyes. He really understood the horror of the situation, but he realized it too late. I thought we were doing the right thing, he muttered. Carol said that it was dangerous to live alone at your age, that you needed constant care. Harvey, I interrupted him, I'm 75, not 95. I take care of my own house, cooking, cleaning, shopping. I have no memory or coordination problems. My only problem is my sister-in-law, who decided I was interfering with her plans. We both looked at Carol, who was now talking to the fourth lawyer. She was explaining the situation, trying to present the case as if she was concerned about her elderly father-in-law's welfare rather than her own. "Yes, that's right," she said into the phone. "He lives alone in a big house, and we're worried about his safety." "What? Guardianship? Is that possible?" "Right. We'd have to prove incapacity." "Okay, well, thanks for the advice." "Now she wants to declare me incompetent," I said to Harvey. "Your wife will stop at nothing." Harvey looked like he was in physical pain listening to Carol talk. In 8 years of marriage, he apparently had no idea what his wife was capable of doing to achieve her goal. "Maybe we should just, apologize and forget the whole thing," he suggested tentatively. "I'm afraid it's too late," I replied. "The eviction notice has already been served. The trust commission will know about it when they look at the probate case." "What if we say it was a mistake, that we didn't know about the trust?" "Harvey," I said gently, "your mother warned you about the possibility of such problems. She said she was setting up the trust specifically to protect me from greed and heartlessness. You just didn't want to get into the details." Carol finished another conversation and walked over to us. Her face took on a determined expression. She had clearly thought of a new strategy. "I found a lawyer who specializes in contesting trusts," she announced. "We're meeting with him tomorrow morning. He says that if the trust was created to deprive the legal heir of rights to the property, it can be invalidated." "That's interesting," I said. "Does this lawyer know that Dorothy didn't create the trust to disinherit Harvey, but to protect me from eviction? The deeds explicitly state that when I die, the house goes to a worthy family member, and Harvey could very well be that person." "Could he?" Carol asked. "Until today," I clarified. "Until the eviction notice." Carol started pacing the room again. Her energy was high, but now it was that of a trapped animal looking for a way out of a trap. "What if we formally withdraw the notice?" she asked. "Say we changed our minds?" "It's too late," I repeated. "The document has already been delivered. The fact is fixed. What's more, I'm obliged to inform the trustee. Dorothy had made it a condition that any attempt to coerce or threaten me should be reported to the bank immediately." Carol's face contorted with anger. She finally realized that Dorothy had foreseen even this scenario. "Your wife was a very smart woman," she said with ill-concealed hatred. "Yes," I agreed, "and she was a very good judge of character." I got up and went to the closet where the family photos were kept. I pulled out an album and found a picture taken about 10 years ago. Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table with some papers and legal books beside her. I didn't pay much attention to it then, thinking she was just researching pension issues. Here she is working on documents for the trust fund. I showed Harvey's picture. "Do you remember that day? You walked into the kitchen, saw her at work, and said you didn't want to fill your head with legal nonsense." Harvey looked at the photograph and wrinkled his nose painfully. The memory was apparently coming back to him more and more clearly. "Mom tried to explain the importance of those documents to you then," I continued. "She said she wanted to protect the family from possible conflicts. And you replied that there would never be any problems with inheritance in our family, because we all love each other." "I remember," Harvey said quietly. "I remember that conversation." "Do you remember what Mom said?" I asked. Harvey was silent, but I could tell by the look on his face that he remembered. She said, "People change, son, especially when those who benefit from that change are around," I reminded her. At the time, we thought she was overreacting, but Dorothy was right. Carol heard those words and turned around. "You mean she had planned to deceive us from the beginning?" she exclaimed. "She had set up this trust specifically against me?" "Not against you," I corrected her. "Against anyone who would try to use Harvey to get our house." Dorothy was a teacher. She'd seen a lot of family drama and knew how greed ruined relationships. "But it's not fair," Carol insisted. "Harvey is the only son. He has a right to inherit." "He had a right," I said calmly, "until he decided to kick his father out of the house on his 75th birthday. Harvey sat back down on the couch and wrapped his arms around his head. My son finally realized the magnitude of what had happened. He hadn't just lost the house. He'd lost the right to be called a good son. "Dad," he said without lifting his head, "is there anything I can do to make this right?" "I'd do anything." I looked at him and felt a mixture of pity and disappointment. This broken man was my son, whom I raised, taught to do the right thing, explained the difference between good and evil, and now he's willing to do anything to get his inheritance. I'm afraid not, I answered honestly. Dorothy created the foundation for just such situations. No one can be forced to change the terms of the trust. Carol sat back in her chair and pulled out her cell phone. I could see that she hadn't given up yet and was still looking for a way out. Her fingers quickly dialed another number. Outside the window, the rain had intensified, and the drops were hitting the glass with more force than ever. My 75th birthday was coming to an end, but I felt that the best part was yet to come. The next day, the atmosphere in the house changed dramatically. If Carol and Harvey had been trying to act like caring relatives the day before, now all ceremony had been discarded. I woke to loud voices in the kitchen. They were discussing a plan of action, not really caring whether I could hear them or not. "We have to press him," Carol said in a harsh whisper that could be heard throughout the house. "The old man must have some weaknesses. All this trust fund talk could be a bluff." "Carol, please," Harvey replied tiredly. "He's my father. You can't just—" "Your father stands between us and a house worth $400,000, his wife interrupted him, "and you're still coddling him like a little boy." I got dressed and went down to the kitchen. Carol was standing at the stove with her back to me, preparing breakfast. Harvey was sitting at the table with a clipboard in his hands, but immediately set it aside when he saw me. It was clear from their faces that my appearance had interrupted an important conversation. "Morning." "Good morning," I said, sitting down in my usual seat. "Morning," Carol mumbled without turning around. Harvey nodded silently. He looked like he'd been up all night. The blue circles under his eyes, the mussed hair, the nervous twitching of his eyelids, all told me that my son was under severe stress. Carol placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me, but she did it so abruptly that the fork clinked loudly against the porcelain. Her movements were jerky, aggressive. The polite mask of the caring daughter-in-law had finally slipped from her face. "Raymond," she said, sitting down across from me, "we've been thinking about last night's conversation all night." "And what conclusion did you come to?" I asked, spreading butter on my toast. "The conclusion was that the situation could be resolved peacefully," Carol said, "if you'll come to our side." I raised my eyes and looked at her. There wasn't even a hint of familial warmth in her gaze. Now she was looking at me as if I were an obstacle to be removed in the most efficient way possible. "What exactly do you suggest?" I asked. Carol and Harvey looked at each other. It was obvious that they had discussed this conversation and assigned roles beforehand. "We want you to go to the trustee," Harvey began. "Explain that yesterday's misunderstanding was a mistake, that no one had any intention of evicting you." "Misunderstanding," I repeated. "A beautifully packaged eviction notice with official seals is a misunderstanding?" "Yes, exactly," Carol said. "We just wanted to talk to you about your future living arrangements." "You got it all wrong." The lie sounded so unconvincing that I chuckled. Carol was clearly not used to making excuses. In her job, she was probably always in a position of strength. "So what's next?" I asked. "Next, you tell the trustee that you want to change the terms of the trust," Carol continued. "Add Harvey as a co-trustee, or give him all the rights." "Why would I do that?" I asked. Carol leaned across the table toward me. There was an expression in her eyes that made me think of the predators in wildlife documentaries. "Because you're old," she said slowly and clearly, "and you need help, and we're the only people willing to take care of you." "Take care of you," I repeated, "by handing out eviction notices?" "That was a last resort," Harvey interjected. "Sherry, we were really worried about your safety." I set my fork aside and looked at my son carefully. Harvey avoided a direct look, but I could see that he didn't believe what he was saying. He was just repeating what his wife had told him to say. "Harvey," I said, "tell me honestly, did you come up with the nursing home idea yourself, or was it Carol's suggestion?" My son blushed and mumbled something inaudible. "It doesn't matter whose idea it was," Carol interrupted him sharply. "The important thing is that we offer a reasonable solution. You give the rights to the house to Harvey, and we guarantee you a decent old age." "What kind of guarantees?" I asked. "We'll find you a good retirement home," Carol explained. "We'll visit you regularly, make sure you're in good health, and when the house is sold, you'll get your share of the money." "What share?" Carol hesitated. Obviously, she hadn't expected me to ask specific questions. "We'll discuss it," she said evasively. "The important thing is that you have enough for everything you need." So you'll decide how much I need to live, I realized. Very generous. Raymond, don't be ironic, Carol said coldly. We're trying to find a fair solution for everyone. Fair, I repeated. What's fair about you getting a $400,000 house and me getting a bed in an almshouse? Don't call it an almshouse, Carol snapped at me. Modern homes for the elderly are… I know, she interrupted. I know, I interrupted. Comfortable and safe. You said that yesterday. Carol got up from the table and started pacing the kitchen. Her patience was clearly running out, and she was moving on to harsher methods of persuasion. Listen, old man, she said, stopping in front of me. You can agree voluntarily, and then everything will be civilized. Or we'll find other ways to solve the problem. What other ways? I asked calmly. You might have health problems, Carol said meaningfully. At your age, all sorts of things happen. Falls, fainting, loss of orientation. Doctors might declare you incompetent. Threats. Now it was down to outright threats. Carol no longer hid her intentions and would do anything to get the house. Are you threatening me? I clarified. I'm explaining reality, she replied. Old people often fall and get injured, especially those who live alone in a big house. Harvey raised his head and looked at his wife with horror. Carol, what are you saying? He whispered. I'm telling the truth, she cut off. Your father is a stubborn old man who doesn't understand his own self-interest. Sometimes people like that need help to make the right decision. I got up from the table and went to the window. It was a clear fall day outside, not at all like yesterday's rainy day. The sun was shining on the garden, where Dorothy's roses were still blooming. The beauty of nature contrasted with the ugliness of what was happening in the kitchen. How parental. You know, Carol, I said without turning around. Dorothy saw this coming. What do you mean? She asked warily. There's a special coercion clause in the terms of the trust, I explained. If anyone tries to force me to change the terms of the trust by threats or physical force, they are automatically disinherited forever. Carol froze in the middle of the kitchen. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice sounded unsure. Shall we test it? I suggested, turning to her. You can keep threatening me with accidental falls and injuries, and I'll record our conversation on my phone and give the recording to the trustee. I pulled out my old cell phone and turned on the recorder. Say something else about old people falling and getting hurt, I suggested. Let the committee listen. Carol's face contorted with rage. She realized she had fallen into a trap set 10 years ago by a wise woman she had never met. Your late wife was a cunning bitch, she spat out. Carol, Harvey exclaimed. What? She snapped. Carol, what? She tricked us all. She set up that damn foundation so we'd never get a house. She created the foundation to protect me from people like you, I replied calmly. And, as you can see, she was very astute. Carol grabbed her cup off the table and threw it into the sink. The cup shattered, and the pieces scattered all over the kitchen. I hate this house, she screamed. I hate you and your sainted Dorothy. For 3 years I've lived here as a servant, putting up with your whims and your memories of your dead wife. Sonorum, no one forced you to stay here, I said. Yes, I did. Carol pointed her finger at Harvey. Him, your precious little boy who can't make a single decision without Daddy's approval. Harvey sat as pale as death and looked at his wife as if he were seeing her for the first time. That's enough, I said firmly. I think this conversation is over. Carol turned and walked out of the kitchen, slamming the door loudly. A few seconds later, I heard the bedroom door slam upstairs. Harvey and I were left alone. My son sat with his head down and remained silent. I could see his shoulders shaking. Dad, he said at last, I'm sorry for everything. I looked at him and felt pity. Not anger, not disappointment. Pity for a weak man who'd been held hostage by someone else's greed. Harvey, I said, you need to decide whether your home or your family is more important to you, because you can't have both. The week after the kitchen scandal passed in tense silence. Carol and Harvey hardly spoke to me, but talked to each other in muffled voices behind closed doors. I could hear them discussing things, moving things around, making phone calls. The atmosphere in the house became so heavy that even the air seemed thick with mutual dislike. For the first 2 days, they still tried to behave in a civilized manner, but by Thursday, all ceremony had been discarded. Carol didn't make breakfast for the whole family. Harvey stopped saying hello when he came down to the living room. We lived in the same house like strangers who happened to be in the same place and were anxious to be separated. I watched their floundering with the curiosity of a naturalist studying the behavior of animals in captivity. Carol left the house several times with folders of documents, apparently still trying to find a legal way around the terms of the trust. Harvey sat at his computer all day long, but I could see that he wasn't working, but wandering aimlessly around the internet, as if he were trying to escape reality in a virtual world. In the evenings, they had long meetings in the bedroom. Their voices were muffled, but their intonations were clear. Carol spoke sharply and demandingly. Harvey answered guiltily and uncertainly. Sometimes I could hear her raise her voice, and he would mumble something back. These late-night discussions lasted late into the night, and in the morning both looked sleep-deprived and irritable. On Monday, Carol began moving boxes of belongings out of the house. She did so defiantly, stomping loudly up the stairs and slamming closet doors noisily. Every movement she made was to show me the loss I was incurring by losing her presence in the house. On Tuesday, Harvey joined in the packing. He worked silently, but I could see how hard every movement was for him. My son clearly didn't want to leave his childhood home, but he didn't know how to change the situation. 8 years of marriage had accustomed him to obeying Carol's decisions, and now he couldn't find the strength to resist. On Wednesday morning, Carol came down to the kitchen with 2 large suitcases. She was dressed in a strict business suit and looked as if she were going to an important meeting, not moving out of the house where she had lived for 3 years. Her face had taken on a stony expression. No emotion, just cold determination. "Soronaim, we're leaving," she announced, setting her suitcases by the front door. "Tonight." I sat at the kitchen table with my morning coffee and the newspaper. The news didn't come as a surprise to me. I'd seen them preparing to leave for days. Boxes, suitcases, phone calls to landlords. Everything pointed to the imminent move. "I see," I said calmly. "Where to?" "We've rented an apartment on Maple Street," Carol said dryly. "Temporary. Until we find something suitable to buy." She said the words as if their departure had been a voluntary decision, not a forced one. Carol maintained the illusion of control over the situation to the end. Her tone was one of ill-concealed irritation. Her plans had fallen through, but she wasn't about to show weakness. "Maple Street," I repeated. "It's a nice neighborhood. The apartments aren't cheap, though." "We can handle it," Carol said. "Why, we have savings." Savings she'd hoped not to spend on rent, but to invest in fixing up my house after I moved out. Now that money would have to be used for its intended purpose, to pay for her own place. Harvey showed up a few minutes later with another suitcase and a box of what sounded like books. My son looked a few years older. His hair was disheveled, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes had the expression of a man who had lost all bearings in life. "Hi, Dad," he said quietly, not looking up. "Hi," I replied. We looked at each other across the kitchen, and I could see that Harvey wanted to say something, but he couldn't. The words were stuck in his throat, and he just opened and closed his mouth like a beached fish. A week of silence had built up a wall between us that was hard to break down with a few words. "Harvey, stop stalling," Carol said sharply. The cab was on its way. My son nodded and set his suitcase next to the others. His movements were slow, uncertain. Harvey clearly didn't want to leave, but he didn't know how to stay. 8 years of marriage had taught him to make his own decisions, and now he was floating on the current that Carol was directing. I got up from the table and walked to the window overlooking the road. A few minutes later, a yellow cab pulled up in front of the house. The driver got out and headed for the porch. Apparently, Carol had ordered help with her luggage. The car was large, a 7-seater, indicating the amount of stuff they were going to carry. "The car is here," I reported. Carol nodded and started carrying the suitcases out. Harvey helped her silently, but I could see his hands shaking as he picked up especially heavy things. The nervous tension was taking its toll on his physical condition. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight over the week and looked exhausted. The cab driver, an elderly African-American man wearing a baseball cap, helped them load their luggage into the car. He was polite but aloof, probably used to staying out of his passengers' family dramas. Professional indifference to other people's problems. "Everything's ready," Carol said as she went back into the house to get the last of her things. She walked through to the living room and picked up her purse from the couch. Then she stopped in the middle of the room and looked around with a careful eye, as if she were evaluating the property she might own. Her eyes were filled with regret, not for a broken relationship, but for lost profits. "It's a beautiful house," she said with a strange smile. "It's a shame it had to turn out like this." "It's not a shame," I countered. "It worked out exactly the way it was supposed to." Carol turned to me, and I could see the hatred in her eyes that she was no longer trying to hide. The mask of the caring daughter-in-law had finally come off, revealing her true attitude toward her father-in-law. "Do you think you won?" she asked. "Do you think your precious Dorothy protected you?" "I think she protected the house from people unworthy of living in it," I answered. "Unworthy," Carol repeated with a bitter chuckle. "Are you worthy? A lonely old man who clings to the past and can't let go of his dead wife?" "I know it's better to cling to good memories than to chase other people's possessions," I said calmly. Carol wanted to answer something, but Harvey appeared in the doorway of the living room. "Carol, the driver's waiting," he said tiredly. "The meter's ticking. We should go." She gave me one last angry look and headed for the exit. She walked with suppressed rage and frustration. 3 years of plans and calculations gone to waste because of the foresight of a woman she'd never known personally. Harvey lingered for a few seconds, looking at me with an expression that was a mixture of shame, guilt, and some childish confusion. My grown son suddenly looked like a boy who'd made a mess of things and didn't know how to apologize. "Dad," he began, but his voice trailed off. "What, Harvey?" I asked. "Yeah, I don't know what to say." "Then it's better not to say anything," I suggested. "Sometimes silence is better than insincere words." Harvey wasn't ready for an honest conversation, and I didn't see the point in empty apologies that didn't change anything. My son nodded and walked toward the door. At the door, he turned around one more time. "Maybe I could come visit you?" he asked uncertainly. "Maybe," I answered, making no promises. "Harvey!" Corinna, Carol called from the porch. "Now!" She sounded impatient and annoyed. She didn't want to give Harvey a chance to change his mind or get along with me. Controlling her husband was more important to her than family ties. My son sighed and walked out of the house. I remained standing in the living room listening to the sounds of their departure. The slamming of car doors, the noise of the engine, the squeak of brakes on the curve. Then there was silence. I went to the window and looked out at the empty road. The yellow cab had already disappeared around the corner, taking with it 3 years of tension, lies, and attempts to take over my house. The air in the room felt instantly lighter, as if all the poison had been drained out of it. The house seemed unusually quiet after a week of whispers and muffled conversations, but it was a good silence. Quiet, peaceful. The kind of silence you get after a thunderstorm, when the air clears and you can breathe freely again. No extraneous sounds, no foreign voices, no lurking threats. I walked through the rooms that were finally mine again. In Harvey and Carol's bedroom, none of their belongings were left. They had taken every last hair clip. The bed was neatly made, the closet was empty, and there wasn't even dust on the nightstand. It was as if they had never been here. But there were still traces of their presence. In the living room was the same glass table with sharp corners that Carol had put in place of Dorothy's chair. Now I could remove it and put back in place the furniture that was dear to my heart, to restore the house to the way it had been in Dorothy's time. Back in the living room, I sat down in my favorite chair and felt truly relaxed for the first time in many days. No longer did I have to watch every word, fear eavesdropping, feel like a stranger in my own home. I was the master of my life again. My morning papers were still on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left them before breakfast. No one else had asked me to put them away for important clients and pictures of the house. I could read the news at my own pace, drink coffee from my favorite cup, and take my time for no one. The sun peeked through the living room windows, illuminating the pollen that danced in the air. Those golden particles had always annoyed Carol. She was always wiping the windowsills and complaining about the unsanitation. Now the pollen could dance in peace without bothering anyone. For dinner, I decided to make myself a real holiday dinner, not because there was a special occasion, but just because I could. I took out of the freezer the steak I'd bought a week ago, but didn't dare cook because of the tense atmosphere. I opened the bottle of red wine Dorothy had given me for my last birthday. I cooked slowly, happily, enjoying the process. No one rushed me. No one asked when it would be ready. No one suggested ordering a pizza instead of a home-cooked meal. The kitchen was once again a place of creativity, not just a functional space for a quick snack. I went upstairs to my bedroom and walked over to my bedside table, where a silver-framed photograph of Dorothy stood. My wife was smiling from the portrait with her kind, wise smile. She looked exactly as I remembered her, an intelligent, prudent woman who always thought several steps ahead. "Well, Dorothy," I said, "you were right about Carol, and about Harvey, too." Of course, the picture didn't answer, but somehow I felt my wife's presence near me, like she was pleased that her plans had worked out exactly the way she'd envisioned 10 years ago. "Thank you for the trust fund," I continued, "for foreseeing this development, for protecting our home from strangers." I took the photograph in my hands and sat on the bed. Dorothy was photographed in our garden, against the rose bushes she loved so much. She was in her 60s then, her gray hair neatly styled, her eyes shining with that special light that only happy people have. "Now I understand why you didn't want Harvey to know all the details of the trust," I said. "You were afraid he'd tell the wrong person, and you were right, he would have told Carol, and she would have found a way around your terms." Outside the bedroom window, the leaves on the trees Dorothy and I had planted 30 years ago were rustling. They were thin saplings then, but now they have grown into mighty oaks that give shade to the whole lot. Time changes many things, but some things remain the same. Loyalty, honesty, respect for family. "Carol called you sneaky," I told the pictures. "But she was wrong. You were just wise. A wise woman who knew the value of human greed." I put the photograph back on the nightstand and looked out the window at my garden. The roses were still blooming, despite October. Dorothy had chosen varieties that would be pleasing to the eye until frost. Even in this, she had shown foresight. The house no longer seemed too big for one person. It was just the right size for a man who had lived a long life and accumulated many memories. Every room had stories, every corner a piece of the past worth keeping. In the evening, I sat in the kitchen at the same table where only a week ago Carol had threatened me with accidental injuries. Now there was peace here, and I could plan my future life without regard for anyone else's plans or grievances. After dinner, I called an old friend, Jim, who lived on the next block. We hadn't spoken to each other in months. Carol didn't approve of my friends, considered them a bad influence. Now I could reconnect. "Ray," Jim cheered. "How's it going? It's been a long time." "Things are good, Asharana," I replied. "Very good. Do you want to come over for coffee tomorrow?" "Sure. How are Harvey and his wife?" "Moved out," I said briefly. "I'll tell you tomorrow." Jim didn't ask for details over the phone. He was a sensitive man and realized that some topics were better discussed in person. Solitude turned out to be much better than toxic society. In silence, you can hear your own thoughts. In peace, you can get a real taste of life. I didn't regret Harvey and Carol leaving. On the contrary, I was relieved that this unpleasant story was finally over. Before I went to bed, I went through the house one more time, checking the locks and turning off the lights. Everything was in order. The house was once again my sanctuary, my fortress, a place where I could be myself. My 75th birthday was indeed special. It was a day of freedom from people who saw me only as an obstacle to other people's possessions. Dorothy was right. Sometimes loneliness is not a punishment, but a reward.